The afternoon I was kidnapped, I was conjugating ancient Greek verbs in my head while waiting for my overpriced latte at a midtown cafe. Columbia University had granted me a rare 2-week sabbatical, and I'd foolishly chosen to spend it in Manhattan instead of somewhere sensible like a library in Oxford or a monastery in Tuscany. My name is Quinn Sinclair. I'm 28 years old, and I speak 7 dead languages fluently. Living languages, not so much. I still struggle with modern Italian, which is ironic considering what happened next. The black SUV pulled up so smoothly I almost didn't notice it. What I did notice was the way the barista's hand froze mid-pour, her eyes widening at something behind me. Before I could turn around, a hand, large, calloused, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and gunpowder, clamped over my mouth. Another arm wrapped around my waist with the efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times before. I tried to scream, but the sound died against his palm as he lifted me off my feet and carried me toward the open vehicle door. My laptop bag fell to the sidewalk, scattering papers covered in linear B translations across the concrete. The last thing I saw before being shoved into the SUV was my research on Mycenaean Greek floating away in the October wind, 2 years of work disappearing into New York traffic. Then a cloth pressed against my face. Chloroform, I realized with the detached clarity of someone in shock, and darkness swallowed everything. I woke up in a room that smelled like old leather, cigar smoke, and money. The kind of money that doesn't ask for permission. My head throbbed, and my mouth tasted like chemicals and fear. As my vision cleared, I took inventory. I was sitting in a velvet armchair that probably cost more than my yearly salary. The walls were paneled in dark mahogany. A massive desk dominated the space, its surface empty except for a single lamp, casting golden light across what appeared to be a penthouse office. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the Manhattan skyline glittering in the evening darkness. We were high up, 40th floor, maybe higher. The door opened, and 3 men walked in. The first 2 were clearly muscle. Broad shoulders, dead eyes, the kind of men who'd seen enough violence to be bored by it. But the third man made my breath catch in my throat for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Well, not entirely. He was tall, probably 6'3", with dark hair that was just beginning to show silver at the temples. His suit was impeccable, Italian, definitely custom, the kind of tailoring that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. But it was his eyes that held me frozen. They were the color of winter steel, cold and assessing, the eyes of a man who'd looked at death so many times they'd made friends. He moved with the controlled grace of a predator, each step deliberate, economical. This was a man who understood power the way I understood ancient syntax, intimately, instinctively, dangerously. "Senator Hartwell's daughter," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in my chest. "Welcome. I apologize for the dramatic retrieval, but your father has been somewhat uncooperative regarding certain legislative matters." I blinked at him, my academic brain struggling to process this information while my survival instincts screamed at me to play along. But I've never been good at lying. It's why I prefer dead languages, where the only people who can call you wrong have been dust for millennia. "I'm not Senator Hartwell's daughter," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "There's been a mistake." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in those cold eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or interest. "Your identification says otherwise." "What identification?" I felt for my purse, but of course it was gone. "I'm Quinn Sinclair. I teach ancient Greek and Latin at Columbia. I don't even know any senators." One of the muscle men, the one with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, stepped forward and handed his boss my driver's license. The man studied it, his face unreadable. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the exact moment he realized his men had grabbed the wrong woman. "Signore," I said, the word slipping out in Sicilian before I could stop it. I'd been studying the Sicilian dialect for a research paper on the linguistic evolution of southern Italian Greek communities. Per favore, c'è stato un errore. Please, there's been a mistake. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The man went absolutely still, his entire body rigid as if I'd struck him. The color drained from his face. His hand, which had been reaching for my license, actually trembled before he caught himself. For a long moment, he just stared at me, and I saw something I never expected to see in the eyes of a man who'd clearly ordered my kidnapping. Vulnerability. What did you say? His voice was barely a whisper. I said there's been a mistake, I repeated in English, suddenly afraid I'd made everything worse. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Say it again. It wasn't a request. In Sicilian, my throat went dry. Every instinct told me this was dangerous territory, but something in his expression, a desperate hunger, almost painful to witness, made me obey. Signore, per favore. C'è stato un errore. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw grief cross his features. When he opened them again, the vulnerability was gone, locked away behind that cold, controlled mask. But his voice, when he spoke, was rougher, more human. Where did you learn to speak like that? I'm a linguist, I explained, trying to keep my voice from shaking. I specialize in ancient and classical languages, but I've been researching Sicilian dialects for a paper on... Get out, he said to his men, cutting me off. They exchanged glances but didn't argue, disappearing through the door with the practiced silence of people who knew when not to question orders. We were alone. He walked to the windows, his back to me, shoulders tense beneath that expensive suit. My grandmother, he said quietly, used to call me Signore when I was a boy. She was from Palermo, died 20 years ago. He turned back to me, and the look in his eyes made my heart hammer against my ribs. No one has called me that since. I didn't know what to say. This was clearly a man who wielded power like a weapon, who'd built an empire on violence and fear, the kind of man I'd only read about in crime novels. Yet here he was, undone by a single word in a language I'd learned from dusty textbooks and recorded interviews with elderly immigrants. I'm sorry, I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. About your grandmother, and about speaking without thinking. It's a bad habit when you study languages. Sometimes they just slip out. He studied me with an intensity that made me feel simultaneously exposed and strangely seen. You really are a professor. Assistant professor, I corrected automatically, then winced. Sorry. Academic reflex. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough to make him look almost human. Almost. Quincy Ravenswood, he said, extending his hand with the formality of a business introduction, as if he hadn't just had me drugged and kidnapped. And you're right. There has been a mistake. I took his hand because refusing seemed like a bad survival strategy. His grip was firm, warm, and sent an unwelcome jolt of electricity up my arm. Quinn Sinclair, I said unnecessarily. Can I go home now? No. The single word hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I didn't want to examine. I pulled my hand back. What do you mean, no? You just admitted this was a mistake. I won't tell anyone what happened. I'll say I got drunk and passed out in a hotel or something. Please, I have classes on Monday, research deadlines. You've seen my face, he interrupted, his voice gentle but implacable. You're sitting in my private office. You know what I am. I know you're dangerous, I said, anger finally overriding fear. I know you kidnap innocent people. I know you probably have Senator Hartwell's actual daughter locked up somewhere, and I know this is all very dramatic and criminal, but I also know I'm nobody. I'm not a threat to you. I'm just a broke academic who spends Friday nights translating Sophocles for fun. Let me go, and I swear I'll forget everything." He walked back to his desk, leaning against it with deceptive casualness. "You speak 7 dead languages?" The non sequitur threw me. "What? You said you specialize in ancient and classical languages. How many?" 7, I admitted, wondering where this was going. Ancient Greek, Latin, Old Norse, Sumerian, Coptic, Biblical Hebrew, and Middle Egyptian. I'm working on Hittite, but the cuneiform is tricky. Say something else in Sicilian. This was insane. I was being held captive by what was clearly a crime boss, and he wanted a language lesson. But arguing seemed counterproductive, so I spoke the first thing that came to mind. A line from a folk song my research subject, a 90-year-old woman from Palermo, had sung during our interview. La luna mezzumari, mamma mia ma maritari. The moon is at mid-sea, mother mine. I want to get married. I saw his jaw tighten, saw him swallow hard. My grandmother sang that song, he said, his voice rough, when she made pasta on Sunday mornings. The next morning, I woke up in a bedroom that belonged in an architectural magazine. The bed was enormous, draped in silk sheets with a thread count that probably exceeded my credit score. The walls were a soft cream, decorated with what I suspected were original Impressionist paintings, not prints, actual paintings. A door to my left opened into a marble bathroom that sparkled with gold fixtures. Another door revealed a walk-in closet stocked with women's clothing in exactly my size. Tags still attached, ranging from casual wear to evening gowns that cost more than my car. I was a prisoner in a gilded cage 40-something floors above Manhattan, and the man holding the key had a weakness for his dead grandmother's dialect. A soft knock preceded a woman entering with a breakfast tray. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes, and the efficient manner of someone who'd served in this household for years. "Mr. Ravenswood thought you might be hungry," she said in accented English, Polish maybe. "He asks that you join him for dinner at 7. "Asks or orders?" I said, more sharply than intended. Her expression didn't change. "With Mr. Ravenswood, there's rarely a difference." She set the tray down on a side table. "I'm Magda. If you need anything, there's an intercom by the bed. Press the blue button." After she left, I examined my prison more carefully. The windows didn't open. Of course they didn't. The door was unlocked, but when I peeked outside, I found a long hallway with a man in a dark suit stationed casually near the elevator. He gave me a polite nod, his jacket doing nothing to conceal the gun holstered beneath it. I retreated back into the room and ate breakfast mechanically. Fresh fruit, perfectly poached eggs, coffee that put my usual Columbia cafeteria swill to shame. Then I showered, dressed in the most modest clothes I could find in the closet, jeans and a cashmere sweater that felt like wearing a cloud, and tried to formulate a plan. The problem was, I had no idea who Quincy Ravenswood actually was. Crime boss, obviously. Dangerous, certainly. But beyond that, I needed information. I needed to understand who was holding me and why a single word in Sicilian had affected him so profoundly. I spent the day exploring my limitations. The bedroom was one of 6 on this floor of the penthouse. The others were locked. I found a library that made my academic heart weep with joy. Floor-to-ceiling shelves holding what appeared to be first editions, rare manuscripts, leather-bound volumes in multiple languages. Someone here loved books the way I did. I ran my fingers along the spines, reading titles in Latin, Greek, Italian, French. "The Sicilian collection is on the 3rd shelf," a voice said from the doorway, making me jump. Quincy Ravenswood stood there in casual clothes, dark jeans and a black cashmere sweater that emphasized his broad shoulders. Without the armor of his suit, he looked younger, more approachable. Still dangerous, but human dangerous, rather than predator dangerous. "You read Sicilian?" I asked, proud that my voice didn't shake. My grandmother taught me. She refused to speak Italian, said it was the language of the North, of people who looked down on Sicilians. He walked into the library, his movements fluid and controlled. These were her books. She left them to me when she died. I looked at the collection with new eyes. Poetry, folk tales, historical accounts, all in the Sicilian dialect that had changed everything yesterday. She must have been an educated woman. She was the daughter of a fisherman who could barely write his own name, Quincy said, pulling out a volume and handing it to me. But she taught herself to read by candlelight, memorized poetry, learned proper Italian just to prove she was as good as the northern city women who looked down on her. His voice carried a mixture of pride and old pain. She came to New York in 1960 with nothing but these books and a determination to give her children a better life. I opened the book, a collection of poetry by someone named Ignazio Butita, written entirely in Sicilian. The pages were yellowed with age, the margins filled with handwritten notes in a spidery script. These notes, are they your grandmother's? She wrote down translations, context, memories. He stood close enough that I could smell his cologne, something woodsy and expensive. She used to read them to me when I was young, said the language of your ancestors should never die just because you cross an ocean. I looked up at him, seeing past the crime boss exterior to something more complicated underneath. What was her name? Agnesa. The way he said it, with perfect Sicilian pronunciation, made it sound like a prayer. Agnesa Ravenswood. She made my grandfather take her last name instead of his when they married. Said the Ravenswood family had power in New York, and she wanted that power for her children. Clever woman. Ruthless woman, he corrected, but there was affection in his voice. She built half of what my family became. Taught me everything about loyalty, about protecting what's yours, about using fear as a tool but never letting it rule you. He took the book from my hands, his fingers brushing mine. She also taught me that the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun or money, it's words. The right words, in the right language, at the right time, can break a man or build an empire. Is that why you kept me? I asked quietly. Because I spoke the right words. His eyes met mine, and I saw something raw there, something vulnerable beneath all that control. I kept you because when you called me Signore in my grandmother's voice, in her language, you made me remember who I was before I became this. He gestured at himself, at the expensive penthouse, at the empire of violence I could only imagine. And I haven't figured out yet whether that's a gift or a curse. Before I could respond, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his expression hardened back into the mask of the crime boss. I have business to attend to. We'll have dinner at 7 as planned. Magda will show you to the dining room. What if I refuse to have dinner with you? He paused at the door, looking back with something that might have been amusement. Then you'll get very hungry, because that's the only meal being served. I'm not your jailer, Quinn. But I'm not your friend either. I'm trying to figure out what you are. After he left, I sank into one of the library's leather chairs, my mind racing. This was insane. I was being held captive by a mob boss who collected his dead grandmother's books and got emotional over Sicilian dialect poetry. A man who'd kidnapped the wrong woman and now seemed unable to let her go because she reminded him of his past. I needed to escape. But I also needed to understand what I'd stumbled into, because the way he'd looked at me when I spoke Sicilian wasn't just nostalgia. It was hunger, and I wasn't sure if that made me more dangerous to him, or him more dangerous to me. At 7 o'clock, Magda knocked on my door and led me through the penthouse to a dining room that could have hosted a state dinner. A table set for two occupied the center of the space, candles flickering despite the modern lighting, crystal and china gleaming. Quincy stood by the window, a glass of wine in his hand, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. You came, he said without turning around. I was hungry. I took my seat, determined not to be intimidated by the wealth on display. And Magda said the chef made osso buco. He turned then, a genuine smile crossing his features. You like Milanese cuisine? I like any cuisine when I'm not the one cooking it. Teaching salary doesn't leave much room for fancy ingredients. He sat across from me, and for a surreal moment, it felt almost normal. Two people sharing a meal, making small talk. Then I remembered the armed guard outside my door, the fact that I was here against my will, the violence this man certainly commanded with a word or a gesture. Tell me about your research, he said as the first course appeared. Some kind of seafood appetizer that probably cost more than my monthly groceries. Why? Because I'm curious. And because we're going to be spending time together until I figure out what to do with you. What are my options? I asked, fear sharpening my voice. Let me guess. Stay here forever, or disappear permanently. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Those aren't your only options, but they might be the safest ones, for both of us. I'm not a threat to you. I've told you that. You don't understand what you are. He leaned forward, his intensity pinning me in place. You walked into my office and spoke to me in a language only one person has used with me in 20 years. You triggered memories I'd buried, made me feel things I'd learned to shut off. In my world, Quinn, anything that can affect me that profoundly is either a weapon or a weakness, and I can't afford either. I set down my fork, my appetite gone. So I'm trapped here because I studied the wrong dialect? You're here because I don't trust myself to let you go. Not yet. He took a sip of wine, his gaze never leaving my face. Tell me about your research, please. The please surprised me enough that I found myself answering. I'm studying linguistic evolution in isolated diaspora communities, specifically how Sicilian immigrants in New York maintained their dialect across generations while being surrounded by other languages. It's about cultural preservation, identity, the ways language connects us to our past. Like my grandmother's books. Exactly like your grandmother's books. Those annotations she made, they're gold for researchers. They show how she navigated between Sicilian, Italian, and English, how she code-switched depending on context. Would you like to study them? The offer was casual, but his eyes were sharp, watching my reaction. The books, I mean, for your research. I stared at him. You're offering me access to rare linguistic materials while holding me prisoner? I'm offering you something to do besides plot escape routes that won't work. He gestured around us. This penthouse is secure. The building is secure. I have men on every floor. Even if you made it to the street, where would you go? To the police? To tell them what? That Quincy Ravenswood kidnapped you? The way he said his own name made it clear that going to the police would be useless, possibly fatal. He owned them, or enough of them to make it not matter. I could tell Columbia, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. My department chair, my colleagues, already know you're taking a personal leave. He saw my expression and continued. I had someone send an email from your account. Family emergency. They were very sympathetic. Anger flared hot in my chest. You can't just erase my life. I'm not erasing it. I'm pressing pause. He stood, walking around the table to where I sat. Quinn, I know this isn't fair. I know you didn't ask for any of this. But right now, you're safer here than you would be anywhere else. Safer from what? From you? From the people who are looking for Senator Hartwell's actual daughter. From my enemies who might try to use you as leverage if they discover I've taken an interest in you. From the complications your freedom would create for both of us. He crouched beside my chair, bringing us eye level. This close, I could see the faint scars on his knuckles, the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hard decisions. I'm not the good guy in this story, Quinn. I've done things that would make you sick. I've built an empire on violence and fear, and I won't apologize for it. But I'm also not going to hurt you, and I'm not going to let anyone else hurt you either. Why? I whispered. Why do you care? His hand came up, hovering near my face before dropping back to his side, as if he'd caught himself about to cross a line. Because when you speak Sicilian, I hear my grandmother's voice, and I haven't felt anything close to peace in 20 years. I'm selfish enough to want to hold on to that feeling for a while longer. The days blurred together in a strange routine that felt increasingly surreal. I spent my mornings in Quincy's library, carefully documenting Agnesa Ravenswood's annotated books. The work was genuinely fascinating. Her notes revealed a woman of fierce intelligence who'd used language as a tool for survival and advancement. She'd written observations about American culture in the margins, comparisons between Sicilian idioms and English phrases, poems she'd composed herself in a mixture of dialects. Quincy would join me around lunchtime, bringing food from the chef, always Italian, always perfectly prepared. We'd eat in the library, and slowly, cautiously, we began to talk. Not about his criminal empire or my captivity. Those topics remained unspoken truces between us. Instead, we talked about language, memory, the ways our pasts shaped who we became. She used to quiz me, he said one afternoon, flipping through a volume of Sicilian folk tales. Every Sunday after church, she'd pick a proverb and make me translate it, explain what it meant, how it applied to our lives. Do you remember any of them? He closed his eyes, and when he spoke, it was in perfect Sicilian. Ku nesci ari nesci. He who leaves succeeds. She'd say it whenever I talked about wanting to leave the neighborhood, go to college, be something different than what the family business expected. Did you? Leave, I mean. I went to Columbia, actually. Business school. He saw my surprise and smiled without humor. Not so different from you, once upon a time. I had this idea I'd legitimize the family enterprises, turn organized crime into organized business. Learn the enemy's language, my grandmother said. Know how they think, how they operate. What happened? His expression hardened. My father was killed in a territorial dispute when I was in my second year. My uncle took over, but he was weak. Too many compromises, not enough vision. The family started losing ground, losing respect. I came home for the funeral and never left. He set down the book with careful precision. My grandmother died 6 months later. Doctors said it was her heart, but I think she just couldn't bear watching her family crumble after everything she'd built. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. She made me promise something before she died. He looked at me then, his steel gray eyes intense. She said, Quincy, you'll do terrible things. You'll have to. It's the world we live in. But never forget the boy who loved words more than weapons. Keep that boy alive somewhere, even if you have to hide him. Because the day he dies completely is the day you become a monster. The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. This was the man who controlled organized crime on the East Coast, who had people kidnapped in broad daylight, who commanded an empire built on violence. Yet here he was, sharing his grandmother's deathbed wisdom with a woman he was holding prisoner. Is that why you kept her books? To remember that boy? I kept them because they were all I had left of her. But yes, sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I read her annotations. Try to hear her voice in the words. Try to remember who I was before I became this. He gestured at himself, at the expensive clothes and the power they represented. And then you walked into my office and called me Signore, in her exact accent, her exact intonation, and suddenly that boy I've been hiding felt real again for the first time in 2 decades. I didn't know what to say to that. The Stockholm Syndrome implications were obvious. I was empathizing with my captor, seeing him as human rather than monster. But it was also true that the more time I spent with Quincy Ravenswood, the more complicated he became. He was violent and controlled, yes, but he was also intelligent, cultured, surprisingly well-read. He quoted Dante in Italian and discussed linguistic theory with genuine interest. He had paintings by Caravaggio on his walls and opera playing softly in the background during dinner. He was a killer who cried over his grandmother's poetry, a monster who wanted to remember the boy who loved words. And God help me, I was beginning to understand why that combination was so dangerous. On the 5th night of my captivity, everything changed. I was getting ready for bed. The nightly dinner routine had become almost comfortable, which should have terrified me more than it did, when I heard shouting from somewhere in the penthouse. Raised voices, the sound of something breaking, then silence so complete it made my skin crawl. I pressed my ear against the door, heart hammering. Footsteps approached, fast and purposeful. Then Quincy's voice, low and deadly in a way I hadn't heard before. "Get her to the safe room, now." My door opened to reveal Magda, her kind face now tight with fear. "Come with me, Quinn. Quickly. What's happening?" "No time, please." She grabbed my arm and pulled me into the hallway. The guard who was usually stationed there was gone. We ran, through corridors I hadn't seen before, deeper into the penthouse, until we reached what looked like a solid wall. Magda pressed her palm against it, and a section slid open to reveal a small room lined with monitors, supplies, and a single chair. "Stay here," she commanded, pushing me inside. "Don't open this door for anyone except Mr. Ravenswood. Don't make a sound." "Magda, what?" But she was already closing the door, sealing me in darkness except for the glow of the monitors. I watched in horrified fascination as security cameras showed me different angles of the penthouse, the library where I'd spent my days, the dining room where we'd shared meals, the hallway outside my bedroom, and men with guns moving through the space like deadly shadows. I watched Quincy on one of the screens, standing in what looked like his office, perfectly calm as 5 armed men fanned out around him. He was unarmed, or appeared to be, hands visible at his sides, expression unreadable. The lead man said something I couldn't hear through the silent feed. Quincy replied, equally inaudible from my hiding place. Then violence erupted. Quincy moved faster than anyone his size should be able to move, grabbing the nearest man's gun hand and twisting until something broke. I saw the man's mouth open in a scream I couldn't hear. 2 more men rushed him, and Quincy fought like someone who'd been trained for war, efficient and brutal. A knife appeared in his hand from nowhere. Blood splattered across the camera lens. I turned away, pressing my hand against my mouth to keep from being sick. This was the reality I'd been ignoring behind our pleasant conversations and shared meals. This was what Quincy Ravenswood actually was. A man who killed without hesitation, who moved through violence like it was breathing. The fight lasted maybe 3 minutes. When I forced myself to look again, 4 men were down, not moving, definitely not getting up again. And the 5th was on his knees, Quincy's knife at his throat. Quincy was speaking to him, his expression cold and controlled despite the blood on his clothes. The man nodded frantically. Quincy released him, and the man scrambled away, disappearing off camera. Then Quincy looked directly at the camera that was filming me, as if he knew exactly where I was hidden. His expression softened, just slightly, and he mouthed 2 words I could read clearly on his lips. "I'm sorry." It took another hour before he came to release me from the safe room. He'd changed clothes, washed the blood away, but there was a cut on his cheekbone, and his knuckles were swollen. He stood in the doorway, blocking the light from the hallway, and for a long moment we just looked at each other. "I know what you're thinking," he said finally, "that you've been having dinner with a monster. that I'm exactly what you feared when you woke up here." "Who were they?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. "The Marchetti family. They've been trying to move into my territory for 6 months. They heard rumors I'd taken the senator's daughter and saw an opportunity." His jaw tightened. "They were wrong about who you are, but right that you've become a liability, a weakness. I didn't ask to be here. I didn't ask to become your weakness." "I know." He stepped into the safe room, and in that small space, he seemed even larger, more overwhelming. "But you are, and now they know it. Which means I can't let you go, and I can't keep you here safely. I've created an impossible situation for both of us. So what happens now?" He reached out, his bruised hand gentle as it cupped my face. I should have pulled away, should have recoiled from the touch of a man who'd just killed 4 people in his living room. But I didn't, because beneath the violence and the power, I could still see that boy who loved words more than weapons. The man who cried over his grandmother's poetry. "Now," he said quietly, "I teach you something my grandmother taught me. In Sicilian there's a phrase, kunesci arinesci, he who leaves succeeds. But there's another phrase she loved even more, ku resta luta, he who stays fights." His thumb brushed across my cheekbone. "I'm not leaving, Quinn. I'm fighting. For you. For this impossible thing between us. For the boy I thought was dead until you spoke to me in his language. There's nothing between us except kidnapping and Stockholm Syndrome," I whispered, even as I leaned into his touch. "You're right, which is why I'm going to do something I've never done before." He dropped his hand, stepping back. "I'm going to give you a choice. Tomorrow morning, Magda will bring you an envelope. Inside is a new identity, a bank account with enough money to start over anywhere in the world, and instructions for contacting a man who can get you out of New York safely. You can take it and disappear. I won't stop you. I won't look for you. You'll be free. And if I don't take it?" His smile was sad, knowing, dangerous. "Then you stay. You keep teaching me Sicilian, keep translating my grandmother's books, keep reminding me of who I was before I became this. You become part of my world, my empire, my violence, my life. You become mine, in all the ways that word implies. And I become yours, with all the complications that brings. That's not a choice. That's an ultimatum. No, it's a door I'm leaving open when every survival instinct I have is telling me to lock it shut." He turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. "You've seen what I am now, Quinn. All of it. The words and the weapons, the poetry and the blood. Tomorrow morning you decide which one you can live with." After he left, I sank onto the chair, my mind spinning. This was insane. I should take the envelope, take my freedom, run as far from Quincy Ravenswood as possible. Go back to my safe, boring academic life where the most dangerous thing I encountered was a particularly savage peer review. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't that simple. Because somewhere in the past 5 days, between Sicilian translations and stolen conversations, I'd started to see past the monster to the man underneath. The brilliant, broken, surprisingly gentle man who'd built walls of violence around a heart that still remembered how to feel. And God help me, I wanted to know what would happen if those walls came down. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the library, surrounded by Agnese Ravenswood's books, and tried to understand how I'd ended up here. How a simple vacation, a wrong place at the wrong time, had led to this impossible decision. Stay or go. Safety or danger. The life I knew or the life I couldn't even imagine. At dawn, Magda found me there, still awake, still undecided. She set down a manila envelope on the table beside me without a word. Then she placed a second item next to it, one of Agnese's books, the one with the folktales Quincy had been reading from. A yellow sticky note marked a particular page. After Magda left, I opened the book to the marked passage. It was a story about a princess who fell in love with a dragon, written in Sicilian dialect. Agnese had annotated the margins with her distinctive spidery handwriting. At the end of the story, she'd written in English, unusual for her. Sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the monster you fear, but the human you didn't expect to find underneath. And sometimes, loving the monster and the human together is the only way either of them survives. I looked at the envelope, then at the book, then at the Manhattan skyline brightening with morning light beyond the windows. And I made my choice. I found Quincy in his office, standing at the windows where I'd first seen him 6 days ago. He hadn't slept either. I could tell from the tension in his shoulders, the shadows under his eyes visible in his reflection in the glass. The envelope sat on his desk, still sealed. The book lay beside it, open to Agnese's final note. "You read it," he said without turning around. Not a question. She was a wise woman. I walked into the room, each step feeling like crossing a border I couldn't uncross. She understood loving complicated people, dangerous people. He turned then, and the vulnerability in his expression nearly broke me. "Quinn, I'm not leaving." The words came out stronger than I felt. I'm staying. Not because I have Stockholm Syndrome or because I'm afraid, but because I want to finish translating your grandmother's books. Because I want to understand how someone builds an empire from nothing and never forgets where they came from. Because when you speak Sicilian, you become someone different, someone real and raw and beautiful. And I want to know that person better. You don't know what you're choosing. You're right, I don't, but I'm choosing it anyway. I moved closer, close enough to see the pulse hammering in his throat. Your grandmother wrote that sometimes loving the monster and the human together is the only way either survives. So teach me both sides of who you are. Show me the empire and the poetry, the violence and the vulnerability. Let me see all of it. And if you can't handle it, if you realize the monster is too monstrous, the violence too much, then I'll use that envelope, but give me the chance to decide that for myself. I reached up, touching the cut on his cheekbone that had scabbed over during the night. You gave me a choice, Quincy. I'm making it. Now respect it. He caught my hand, pressing it against his face, his eyes closing. You're going to destroy me, he whispered. Or save me. I'm not sure which. Maybe both. He pulled me against him then, his arms wrapping around me with a desperation that spoke of years of isolation, of walls finally crumbling. I felt his heart racing against my chest, felt the tremor in his hands as they pressed against my back. This wasn't romance. Not yet. Maybe never. This was two people recognizing something broken in each other and deciding that broken together might be better than whole alone. Teach me more Sicilian, he murmured against my hair. The way my grandmother spoke it. Not from books or recordings, but the way you hear it in your research. Real and alive. So I did. Standing there in his office with Manhattan waking up beyond the windows and his empire waiting for orders he wasn't giving, I taught Quincy Ravenswood his grandmother's language. We started with simple phrases, vocabulary he'd forgotten or never learned. I corrected his pronunciation, explained the subtle differences between Sicilian and Italian, showed him how the dialect shifted depending on region and context. He was a quick student, of course he was. His mind was sharp, tactical, used to processing information and turning it into advantage. But more than that, he was hungry for this connection to his past. Every word I taught him, every phrase that came back to him, seemed to chip away at the armor he'd built around himself. Say it again, he'd command, and I'd repeat a sentence in Sicilian until he had it perfect. What did my grandmother mean when she said this? and I'd explain the cultural context, the history behind the idiom, the way language carried memory. Days turned into weeks. Quincy's world continued to turn. I'd hear him on phone calls, issuing orders in that cold, controlled voice that made even hardened criminals jump to obey. I'd see him leave for meetings in expensive suits, returning hours later with blood on his knuckles or murder in his eyes. His men began to accept my presence, nodding respectfully when I passed, protecting me as fiercely as they protected him. But in the library, between his grandmother's books, we existed in a different world. I translated Agnes's annotations, while Quincy read them aloud in increasingly fluent Sicilian. We discovered she'd been keeping a diary of sorts, scattered entries across multiple books, recording her observations about building a criminal empire while maintaining humanity. "Listen to this," I said one evening, reading from one of her poetry collections. She wrote, "My grandson asks me if it's possible to be good and powerful at the same time. I tell him it's not only possible, it's necessary. Power without goodness becomes tyranny. Goodness without power becomes martyrdom. The trick is knowing when to show which face." Quincy looked up from the book he was studying, a collection of Sicilian proverbs. She was teaching me how to survive, how to be both the monster and the man. She was teaching you how to stay human in an inhuman world. I set down the journal carefully. These aren't just language notes, Quincy. They're a manual for navigating moral complexity. She was giving you permission to be more than one thing. Like you're doing now. He stood, crossing to where I sat, surrounded by books and papers. You could have left. You should have left. Instead, you're sitting in a crime boss's library, teaching him dead languages and reading his dead grandmother's philosophy. Why? I met his gaze steadily. Because you're not just a crime boss. You're also a scholar who quotes Dante, a grandson who honors his grandmother's memory, a man who collects first editions and cries over poetry. You contain multitudes, Quincy Ravenswood. And I find multitudes fascinating. He knelt beside my chair, bringing us eye level. I killed those men in front of you, on camera. You watched me murder 4 people without hesitation. I know. Doesn't that terrify you? Yes. I touched his face, feeling the roughness of stubble under my palm. But you know what terrifies me more? The fact that it doesn't terrify me enough. That I can reconcile the violence I saw with the gentleness you show with these books. That I'm starting to understand why you do what you do. Not agree with it, but understand it. I leaned closer. Your grandmother wrote that the most dangerous thing isn't the monster you fear, but the human you didn't expect to find underneath. I think she was wrong. The most dangerous thing is finding both and loving them anyway. You love me? His voice was barely a whisper, vulnerable in a way I'd never heard. I don't know. Maybe. Probably. I laughed, the sound edged with something like hysteria. I'm an academic, Quincy. I'm supposed to study human behavior, not participate in Stockholm Syndrome relationships with mobsters. This violates every ethical guideline and probably several laws. But yes, I think I'm falling in love with you. Both of you. The monster and the man. He kissed me then, and it was nothing like I expected. Not demanding or possessive, but almost reverent. Like I was something precious he was afraid to break. His hands cradled my face with a gentleness that contradicted everything I knew about him, and when he pulled back, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Ti amo, he whispered in Sicilian. I love you. Just like my grandmother used to say to my grandfather. Ti amo, Quinn Sinclair. With all the violence and poetry, all the blood and beauty. Ti amo. Anchu ti amo, I whispered back. I love you too. The words felt sacred in his grandmother's language, weighted with history and hope. That night, everything changed between us. Not just physically, though yes, that too. His touch surprisingly gentle for hands that had killed. His whispered Sicilian endearments more powerful than any poetry. But fundamentally, we stopped being captor and captive, monster and victim. We became something new, something neither of us had names for yet. But love in Quincy Ravenswood's world came with complications. His enemies had noticed his distraction, his weakness. The Marchetti family wasn't the only one circling, looking for opportunities. And I was the most obvious vulnerability he'd shown in his entire career. "I need to take you somewhere," he said one morning over breakfast, his expression serious. "Somewhere secure until I can stabilize the territorial disputes." "Where?" "Sicily. Palermo, specifically." He saw my surprise and smiled slightly. "My grandmother's family still has property there, a villa in the hills outside the city. It's been maintained but unused for decades. You'll be safe there while I handle business here." "You're sending me away?" "I'm keeping you alive. There's a difference." He reached across the table, taking my hand. "Besides, you wanted to study Sicilian dialects in their native context. Here's your chance. The villa has my grandmother's personal library. Letters, journals, documents she left behind when she came to America. You'll have months of research material." "Months? How long will you need to—" I stopped, understanding. "You're going to war. A real one. I'm consolidating power, eliminating threats, making sure that when you come back, no one will ever dare use you against me again." His grip tightened. "This is what loving me means, Quinn. Sometimes you have to disappear so I can become the monster they fear. But I'll come back. I promise. And when I do, I'll bring you to my grandmother's church, the one where she married my grandfather. And I'll call you Signora instead of Signore, wife instead of just the woman who speaks my language." I stared at him, processing. "Did you just propose to me over breakfast while explaining how you're about to start a mob war?" "Yes." No hesitation, no doubt. "We'll do it properly later, ring, flowers, whatever you want, but I need you to know my intentions. When you come back from Sicily, you come back as family, as mine, officially and permanently, if that's what you want." "That's insane. We've known each other less than 2 months. I knew my grandmother for 17 years, and I'm still discovering her through those books. Time isn't the measure, Quinn. Understanding is. And you understand me, all of me, in a way no one else ever has or will." He stood, pulling me up with him. "So yes, I'm asking you to marry me while I explain that I'm about to do terrible things to keep you safe. Because that's what love looks like in my world. Beautiful and brutal in equal measure." The villa in Palermo was a revelation. Set into the hills overlooking the Mediterranean, it was a honey-colored stone structure that had aged gracefully over centuries. Lemon and olive trees dotted the property. The air smelled of salt water and wild herbs. Inside, every room held memories of Agnes Ravenswood's life before America. Photographs, furniture, the personal library Quincy had promised. I spent my days immersed in her world, reading letters she'd written to cousins who stayed behind, studying the journals where she'd documented her dreams of escaping poverty, of building something greater than what Sicily offered, understanding the woman who'd shaped Quincy into who he was. But I also followed the news from New York on my laptop. Reports of violence in Manhattan's underworld, territories changing hands, bodies found in East River, a consolidation of power among the city's organized crime families. The articles never mentioned Quincy by name, but I knew. I could see his strategic thinking and how the moves played out, systematic and brutal. He called every night at exactly 8 o'clock Palermo time. We'd talk in Sicilian. He was nearly fluent now. And he'd ask about my research, my day, whether I was eating properly. He'd tell me about the weather in New York, about small details of his routine that had nothing to do with the violence I knew he was orchestrating. We never discussed the war. We never talked about the bodies. Those truths hung unspoken between us, acknowledged but not examined. Timanku, he'd say before hanging up. I miss you. And I'd respond in kind, my heart aching with the truth of it. I missed him. God help me, I missed the monster and the man in equal measure. 3 months into my Sicilian exile, I discovered something that changed everything. Deep in Agnese's personal papers, hidden inside a book of poetry, I found a letter addressed to Quincy, written but never sent. The date was 2 days before she died. My beloved grandson, it began in Sicilian. If you're reading this, I am gone. I need to tell you about the Ravenswood fortune, the one my husband's family speaks of in whispers. It exists. In Sicily, hidden in a place only I knew. I never told anyone because power built on hidden wealth corrupts differently than power built through struggle. But if you need it, if the empire we built is threatened, the information is scattered through my books. I turned our family history into a puzzle only someone who understands both languages and memory could solve. Find it, use it, but never forget the cost. Money bought in secret always demands payment in blood. Love forever, Nonna Agnese. I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking. Then I started going through her books with new eyes, looking for patterns, hidden messages, codes embedded in her annotations. It took weeks of careful analysis, cross-referencing dates and locations, treating her notes like the linguistic puzzle they were designed to be. And finally, I found it. Coordinates disguised as poetry references, banking information coded into seemingly random vocabulary notes. The location of a vault in Palermo, containing documents proving ownership of properties, investments, assets worth hundreds of millions of euros, the original Ravenswood fortune that had seeded the American Empire, but was thought lost when the family fled Sicily in the 1930s. I called Quincy at 3 a.m, too excited to wait for our scheduled time. Quinn? His voice was rough with sleep and instant alertness. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. I found it, Quincy. The fortune your grandmother mentioned. She left you a treasure map encoded in Sicilian dialect and linguistic patterns. Silence. Then, explain. I did, walking him through how Agnese had hidden information across multiple books, using language itself as encryption. How she'd trusted that only someone who understood both her grandson and her culture could decode what she'd left behind. How the fortune wasn't just money. It was proof of legitimacy, documentation that would make the Ravenswood family's claim to power unassailable. My God, he breathed when I finished. She gave me the one weapon my enemies can't fight. Legal legitimacy backed by generational wealth. She gave you a choice. You can use this to legitimize everything. Turn organized crime into legitimate business, just like you wanted to do at Columbia. Or you can use it to cement your power in the criminal world, but you can't do both. The paper trail is too clear. Whatever you choose defines the Ravenswood legacy forever. Another long silence. Where is the vault? The Basilica della Madonna della Catena, Old Town Palermo. Your grandmother left instructions for accessing a security deposit box hidden in the catacombs. I paused. Quincy, this is what you wanted. A way to become who you could have been before your father died. She's giving you a second chance. By making me choose between her empire and her dreams for me. His laugh was bitter. Even dead, she's still teaching me lessons. What are you going to do? I'm coming to Sicily. Tonight. Don't go near that basilica without me, Quinn. If what you found is real, it's the most dangerous thing you could possibly know about. Promise me. I promise. Ti amo. The words were fierce, almost desperate. Wait for me. He arrived 36 hours later, appearing at the villa's door with 2 of his men and the controlled intensity of a man who'd traveled halfway around the world without sleeping. I ran to him, and he caught me, lifting me off my feet, burying his face in my hair. "Show me," he said after a long moment. "Show me what my grandmother left behind." We spread the books across the villa's dining table, and I walked him through the puzzle. How language and memory intertwined. How Agnese had used her grandson's love of words to protect the family's greatest secret. Quincy's hands trembled as he held the final letter, reading his grandmother's words in the language she'd taught him. "She knew," he whispered. "When she was dying, she knew I'd need this, that I'd reach a point where I'd have to choose who I wanted to be. And she gave me the tools to become either version, the monster or the man, but not both. What do you choose?" He looked at me, his steel-gray eyes holding mine. "I choose you. I choose the life where you call me Signore, in my grandmother's language, and it means husband instead of crime boss. I choose legitimacy, legality, becoming who I could have been. But first, I have to finish the war I started. I can't leave my people vulnerable when I walk away from that world." "How long?" 6 months. Maybe less. He cupped my face in his hands. "And then we retrieve that fortune. We file the legal documents. And we dismantle my empire piece by piece, transitioning everything legitimate and eliminating everything that isn't. The Ravenswood family becomes what my grandmother dreamed, powerful and legal. And the violence, the blood, ends with me. I'll be the last Ravenswood who builds an empire on fear. After me, it's business, investments, legitimate power." His smile was sad. "My grandmother gave me permission to stop being the monster. I'd be a fool not to take it." That night, we went to the Basilica della Madonna della Catena. The ancient church sat on Palermo's waterfront, golden stone glowing in the moonlight. Quincy's men secured the perimeter while we descended into the catacombs, centuries-old burial chambers that smelled of stone and time. Following Agnese's instructions, we found the hidden niche behind a carved Madonna. Inside was a sealed box, remarkably well preserved. Quincy's hands were steady as he opened it, revealing documents that proved everything: property deeds, banking records, investment portfolios, a fortune built before the family's American reinvention. "She was protecting me," he said, reading through papers that documented legitimate business ventures spanning generations. "If I'd known about this earlier, I might never have built the criminal empire. I could have taken this and made something clean from the beginning. Maybe that's why she hid it. Maybe she knew you needed to walk through darkness to appreciate the light." I touched his arm. "She gave you both, the empire you built and the fortune to escape it. A test and a gift." He pulled me close, there in the catacombs beneath a church where his grandparents had worshipped. "When this is over, the war, the transition, all of it, will you marry me here, in this church?" "Yes." "Will you call me Signore during the ceremony?" "In Sicilian, the way my grandmother would have wanted." "I'll call you Marito," I corrected gently. "Husband. But yes, in Sicilian, in the language that brought us together." The next 6 months were simultaneously the longest and shortest of my life. Quincy returned to New York while I stayed in Sicily, documenting everything we'd found, working with lawyers to prepare the legal framework for legitimizing the Ravenswood assets. He'd call every night, his voice sometimes exhausted, sometimes edged with violence I didn't ask about. I followed the news, watched territories stabilize, saw reports of organizational restructuring in New York's underworld, and slowly, like a tide receding, the violence stopped. Not everywhere, not permanently. That world never truly rests. But enough. enough that Quincy could begin the careful process of transitioning power, legitimizing businesses, cutting ties to criminal enterprises. "It's done," he said one night, his voice rough with emotion. "I signed the papers today. The Ravenswood criminal empire is officially dissolved. Everything left is legal: real estate, investments, businesses that can operate in daylight. I'm free, Quinn. For the first time since I was 22 years old, I'm free." "Then come home," I whispered. "Come to Sicily. Come marry me." He arrived 1 week later, not with an army of bodyguards, but with a single witness, Magda, who'd served his family for decades and deserved to see the end of their story. We stood in the Basilica della Madonna della Catena on a spring morning with sunlight streaming through ancient windows, and I married Quincy Ravenswood in the language of his grandmother. "Signore," I said when the priest asked for my vows, using the formal address that had started everything. "Ti amo." I love the boy who loved words, and the man who loved fiercely enough to walk away from everything he built. "Ti piglio come marito." I take you as husband. He said his vows in Sicilian too, his voice breaking on the words. When he slipped the ring on my finger, I saw tears tracking down his face, the first time I'd seen him cry since that night in his library, when I'd first spoken his grandmother's language. "My grandmother would have loved you," he whispered, as we left the church, married and free. "She would have said you saved me." "I didn't save you. I just reminded you who you already were." We spent our honeymoon at the villa, surrounded by Agnes's books and the life she'd dreamed for her grandson. I continued my research. It would become my life's work, I knew, documenting her linguistic legacy, her wisdom, her complex navigation of power and humanity. Quincy read beside me, now fluent in the language he'd forgotten, reconnecting with the culture he'd lost. "What will you do now?" I asked one evening, as we sat on the terrace overlooking the Mediterranean. "With legitimate power and illegal experience?" "What my grandmother wanted. Use everything I know about how power works, the brutal truths I learned in that world, to build something lasting and clean. Use the violence I understand to protect what's legitimate, become the bridge between the darkness and the light." He pulled me close. "And teach my children Sicilian, if we have them. Make sure they know where they come from and what it cost to get here." "Children?" His smile was genuine, reaching his eyes for the first time since I'd known him. "Someday, when we're ready. Children who'll read their great-great-grandmother's books and understand that humans are complicated. That love is complicated. That sometimes the path from monster to man runs through a woman who speaks the language of your lost childhood." We lived in Sicily for 2 years after that, dividing time between Palermo and New York as Quincy rebuilt his life and I completed my research. The book I published, Language, Memory, and Power, The Linguistic Legacy of Agnes Ravenswood, became the defining work of my career. It was part linguistic analysis, part memoir, part love letter to a woman I'd never met but came to know intimately through her words. Quincy built something remarkable from the ruins of his empire, a foundation supporting Sicilian immigrants, funding language preservation programs, investing in communities his family had once exploited. He used every brutal lesson he'd learned to protect those investments, to fight for them in boardrooms instead of back alleys. The monster became the man, and the man used the monster's knowledge to do good. And every night, in the privacy of our home, I'd call him Signore in perfect Sicilian, and he'd respond Signora, and we'd speak to each other in the language that had saved us both, the language of love, memory, and complicated redemption. 5 years after our wedding in Palermo, I found myself standing in Columbia University's linguistics department, staring at the office that would soon bear my name, Professor Quinn Sinclair Ravenswood, Chair of Classical and Ancient Languages. The university had courted me for 3 years, offering increasingly prestigious positions, until finally Quincy convinced me to accept. "My grandmother would have killed me if I kept you from teaching," he'd said with that half smile I'd come to love. She believed education was the greatest power. Besides, New York is home now. We've built something here. He was right. The Ravenswood Foundation had transformed neighborhoods, funded scholarships, preserved dying languages. Quincy had become an unlikely philanthropist, respected, feared in the right ways, but no longer criminal. He'd learned to wield legal power with the same precision he'd once applied to violence. But the past never truly dies, especially in his world. We both knew that. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was preparing a lecture on Homeric Greek. Quincy's voice on the phone was controlled, careful, the tone he used when delivering bad news. The Marchetti family's youngest son was released from prison yesterday. Antonio. He was doing time for the raid on our penthouse 5 years ago. I gripped the phone tighter, remembering those men Quincy had killed, the blood I'd watched spill across security feeds. What does that mean? It means he knows you exist, knows you were the weakness they tried to exploit, and he's been planning revenge for 5 years in a cell. A pause. I have men on you already. You won't see them, but they're there, and we're leaving for Sicily tonight. Quincy. Not negotiable, Quinn. This is the life we chose. Sometimes the monster's past comes looking for the man's present. We deal with it together. We flew to Palermo that evening, to the villa that had become our sanctuary. But this time, instead of research and quiet intimacy, we were preparing for war. Quincy's men, the ones who'd stayed loyal during the transition to legitimacy, arrived in careful succession. The villa transformed into a fortress. Why Sicily? I asked, as Quincy reviewed security protocols with the efficiency of his criminal past. Why not stay in New York where you have more resources? Because in New York, I'm legitimate now. I can't fight the old way without destroying everything we've built. But here, in my grandmother's homeland, I'm still the boy from Palermo who learned to survive. The rules are different. He looked at me, his steel gray eyes intense. And because if this goes wrong, I want you safe in the place that saved me. Antonio Marchetti made his move 3 days later. Not with violence, he'd learned from his family's mistake. Instead, he went public, releasing carefully edited security footage from the penthouse raid 5 years ago. Quincy killing 4 men while I watched from the safe room. Media outlets across Italy picked it up. American philanthropist's deadly secret past. I watched the news coverage with a sick feeling in my stomach. There I was, frozen on grainy footage, watching Quincy murder 4 people with brutal efficiency. The context was missing. That they'd invaded his home. That I'd been there because of kidnapping. That his entire criminal empire had already been dissolved. All viewers saw was violence and my complicity. They're trying to destroy your legitimacy, I said, as the footage repeated across Italian news channels. Force you back into being the criminal so they can justify taking everything you've built. They're trying to take you from me. Quincy stood at the villa's window, his posture rigid. Antonio knows I gave up the empire for you. He's betting that if he can turn you into a liability, make you the reason I lose everything, you'll leave. And then he'll have his revenge by taking the only thing that ever made me choose humanity over power. I'm not leaving. You should. You could claim you were held captive, manipulated, that you didn't understand what I was. Your career, your reputation. You could save it all by walking away from me. He turned, and I saw raw fear in his expression. I'd understand, Quinn. I'd give you the divorce, the distance, whatever you need to survive this, because I love you too much to let my past destroy your future. I walked to him, taking his face in my hands the way I had that first time in his library. Do you remember what your grandmother wrote? That sometimes loving the monster and the human together is the only way either survives? I'm not leaving because this isn't just your fight. It's ours. We built this life together. We'll defend it together. How? The footage is real. I did kill those men. You did watch. There's no spinning that into something acceptable. No, but there's telling the whole truth. I pulled out my phone, opening a recording app. Your grandmother documented everything. Her empire, her choices, her moral philosophy. It's time I documented ours. Every detail, from my kidnapping to our marriage. The linguistic research that brought me into your world. The fortune that gave you a way out. The choice to become legitimate. All of it. Quinn? I'm a tenured professor at Columbia now. My academic reputation gives me credibility. If I publish our story, the real story, not edited footage, it becomes a narrative about redemption, transformation, the cost of leaving a criminal life. I become the scholar who studied violence and chose to love the man trying to transcend it. I met his eyes. I make us both human instead of monstrous. It took 2 weeks to write. Quincy sat beside me the entire time, filling in details I didn't know, correcting my understanding of his old empire, being brutally honest about every terrible thing he'd done. Magda provided perspective from her years of service. I wove it all together with my academic training, contextualizing violence within systems of power, explaining how language and memory became tools for transformation. The result was part memoir, part scholarly analysis, part love story. I titled it Signore, Language, Violence, and Redemption in Contemporary Organized Crime. It documented everything: the kidnapping, the murders, the empire, the fortune, our marriage, every beautiful and brutal truth. This will end your academic career, Quincy said when he read the final draft. Publishing this means admitting complicity. It means connecting yourself permanently to my past. Good, because I am complicit. I chose to stay. I chose to marry you. I chose to help you become who you are now. Those aren't things I should hide. They're things I should own. I saved the document with finality. Your grandmother faced the same choice: be respectable and powerless, or powerful and complicated. She chose complicated and changed your family's future. I'm making the same choice. We published it first in Italy. A major newspaper ran it serialized over 2 weeks. Then American outlets picked it up. The response was explosive. Some called me deluded, a victim of Stockholm Syndrome who couldn't see her own manipulation. Others called me brave for humanizing someone the media had already convicted of past crimes. Academia was divided. Some institutions condemned me. Others invited me to speak about ethics, redemption, and the complicated nature of human transformation. But the public narrative shifted. Antonio Marchetti's edited footage became part of a larger, more nuanced story. Yes, Quincy had been violent. Yes, I'd witnessed murder. But the context mattered. His transition away from that world. My choice to help him. The legitimate empire we'd built from criminal ruins. You made me sympathetic, Quincy said one night as we watched coverage of the story spreading globally. Made people see past the monster to the person underneath. My grandmother would have loved this, using words as weapons more powerful than violence. Words are violence, in their own way, just more precise. I leaned against him, exhausted but satisfied. Besides, I didn't make you sympathetic. I made you human. There's a difference. The legal challenges came next. Italian authorities investigated the old footage. But 5 years had passed. Jurisdictions were complicated, and the documented dissolution of Quincy's criminal empire made prosecution nearly impossible. Antonio Marchetti's revenge had backfired. Instead of destroying us, he'd forced us to tell a story of transformation that captured global attention. But the personal cost was real. Columbia put me on leave while they investigated my conduct. Several colleagues stopped speaking to me. My parents, who'd thought I was on sabbatical all those years ago, struggled to reconcile their daughter with the woman who'd married a former crime boss. The life I'd known before Quincy was irrevocably changed. Any regrets? Quincy asked one evening, as we walked through the olive groves surrounding the villa. The media circus had finally died down enough that we could venture outside without cameras tracking our every move. Only one, I admitted. That your grandmother isn't here to see this. She orchestrated everything. The puzzle in her books, the fortune, the path out of the criminal world. This was her plan all along, wasn't it? To give you the tools to transform, but make you work for it, earn it, choose it. She always said the greatest lessons came through struggle. He stopped walking, turning to face me. I need to show you something. He led me to a section of the villa I'd never fully explored. A storage room filled with boxes. Inside one was a letter, sealed and addressed to Quinn, the woman who speaks Sicilian. I found this 3 months ago, Quincy explained. Hidden in the last of my grandmother's books we hadn't fully catalogued. She dated it a week before she died. With shaking hands, I opened the letter. The handwriting was Agnese's distinctive script, but weaker, shakier, written by a dying woman. To the woman who will save my grandson. If you're reading this, you found him. You spoke his language, not just Sicilian, but the language of complicated humans who contain both darkness and light. You saw past the monster he had to become, and remembered the boy who loved words. I knew someone like you would come. It's why I scattered clues through my books, why I hid the fortune in linguistic puzzles. I needed Quincy to find a woman intelligent enough to solve what I'd created, brave enough to stay despite the danger, and loving enough to choose redemption over safety. You're not his salvation. He has to save himself. But you're his reminder that salvation is possible, that the boy who cried over poetry isn't dead, just buried deep beneath years of necessary violence. Love him. All of him. The monster and the man. Make him speak Sicilian until he remembers his humanity. Use words to wound and heal in equal measure. Give him children who understand that humans are complicated, that redemption is real, that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is choose love over fear. And when the world judges you for loving someone like him, remember, power exists in many forms. You chose the most dangerous kind, the power to transform a life by refusing to see it in simple terms. That's the same power I wielded, the same legacy I'm trusting you to continue. Ti ringrazio, figlia mia. Thank you, my daughter, for finding him, for saving us both. Con affetto, Agnese. I finished reading with tears streaming down my face. She knew. She orchestrated all of this, including me. No, Quincy said gently. She created the circumstances that allowed us to find each other. What we did with those circumstances, that was our choice. She gave me the puzzle. You chose to solve it. I chose to let you. We chose each other, Quinn. My grandmother just set the stage. We stood there in the dusty storage room, holding each other while I cried for a woman I'd never met, but who'd shaped every aspect of my life. Agnese Ravenswood had understood something fundamental about transformation. It couldn't be forced or given, only enabled. She'd left her grandson a fortune and a mystery, trusting that the right person would find both. And I had. God help me, I had. 6 months later, I was back at Columbia, reinstated after the investigation concluded I'd violated no laws, only social norms about who deserved love and redemption. My classes filled immediately, students curious about the professor who'd married a former mob boss and written about it with academic precision. I taught them about language and power, about how words could transform reality, about the complicated nature of human morality. Quincy's foundation flourished, funding programs that gave people the same choices Agnese had dreamed about: education, opportunity, legitimate paths to power. He testified before Congress about organized crime reform, using his intimate knowledge of that world to dismantle systems that trapped people in cycles of violence. We split our time between New York and Sicily, between teaching and foundation work, between the life we'd built and the past that had shaped us. I published my second book, the expanded version of Signore, with additional research on redemption narratives in contemporary culture. It became required reading in criminal justice programs, sociology departments, ethics courses. And every night, in whatever home we occupied, I'd speak to him in Sicilian. Signore, I'd say, and he'd respond, Signora, and we'd exist in the language that had saved us both. On our 10th anniversary, we returned to the Basilica della Madonna della Catena. No media, no public statement, just us, Magda, and the priest who'd married us a decade before. We renewed our vows in Sicilian, recommitting to the complicated life we'd chosen. Ti amo, Quincy said, his voice steady and sure, for teaching me that the monster and the man could coexist, for choosing love over judgment, for being brave enough to publish our truth, for giving me a life I never thought I deserved. Ti amo, I responded, for letting me see all of you, for doing the impossible work of transformation, for honoring your grandmother's legacy while building your own, for proving that redemption is real, even when it's complicated. As we left the church, a little girl approached us, maybe 6 years old, with dark curly hair and her great-great-grandmother's steel-gray eyes. Our daughter, Elena, named for the Greek word meaning light. We'd taught her Sicilian before English, made sure she knew Agnes's story, raised her to understand that humans contained multitudes. Mama, Papa, she said in perfect Sicilian. Possiamo mangiare granita ora? Can we have granita now? Quincy scooped her up, tickling her until she squealed with laughter. Certo, picciridra. Of course, little one. I watched them together, my former crime boss husband and our daughter, and thought about Agnes's letter, about how she'd known that transformation required witnesses, that redemption needed evidence, that love was the most dangerous weapon because it made change possible. She'd been right about everything. The puzzle she'd created, the fortune she'd hidden, the linguistic breadcrumbs she'd scattered. All of it designed to test whether her grandson could find someone who'd love both his darkness and his light. Someone who'd stay through revelation and violence, who'd choose him over safety, who'd document the complicated truth of transformation without flinching. I'd solved her puzzle not with academic brilliance, but with stubborn, reckless love. And she'd given me something in return. A family, a purpose, a life more complex and meaningful than any I could have imagined in that Columbia cafe where this all began. Signora Professoressa, Quincy said, using the formal title teasingly as we walked through Palermo's ancient streets. What are you thinking about? Your grandmother. How she engineered all of this. How she knew that the right words and the right language could change everything. I squeezed his hand. How she was right, that sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the monster you fear, but the human you find underneath. And the most powerful thing? He prompted, knowing I had more to say. The most powerful thing is choosing to love both, the monster and the man, the darkness and the light, the violence and the poetry. I looked up at him, this complicated man I'd chosen against all reason. That's what your grandmother understood. That's what she gave us. Permission to be complicated together. Elena tugged at my hand, impatient for her promised granita. We followed her to a cafe overlooking the Mediterranean, 3 generations of Ravenswood legacy sitting in the Sicilian sun. The empire Agnes had built transformed into something new. The violence she'd wielded turned toward creation. The words she'd preserved becoming bridges between past and future. Signore, I said quietly, watching our daughter laugh at something only she understood. Ti ringrazio. Thank you. For what, Signora? For forgetting how dangerous it was to love, for being brave enough to be saved, for giving your grandmother's legacy a future she'd be proud of. He kissed me then, there in the Palermo cafe, surrounded by the language and land that had made him. The danger never goes away. Quinn, I still have enemies. Our past still haunts us. The monster is still there, just controlled, directed toward protection instead of power. I know. I did know. Accepted it, chose it anyway. But that's the whole point. Your grandmother didn't want you to stop being dangerous. She wanted you to be dangerous for the right reasons. She wanted you to remember that the boy who loved words was also the man who'd do anything to protect them. Elena climbed into Quincy's lap, sticky from granita, chattering in Sicilian about the boats in the harbor. He held her with the same hands that had once killed to survive, now gently wiping her face clean, listening to her with complete attention. This was Agnesi's true legacy, not the fortune or the empire, but this moment. A former monster loving his child in a language his grandmother had preserved. A woman who'd chosen complicated love over simple safety. A little girl who'd grow up knowing that humans contain darkness and light, and that acknowledging both was the only path to authentic power. Ku neshi arineshi, I murmured. He who leaves succeeds. Ku resta luta, Quincy completed. He who stays fights. Ku ama vinci, Elena added, making up her own proverb in her child's wisdom. He who loves wins. We sat there as the Sicilian sun set over the Mediterranean, speaking the language that had saved us, living the life that had seemed impossible 10 years ago. The monster had become a man. The man had learned to love. And the woman who'd spoken a single word in Sicilian had changed the course of an empire. Somewhere, I like to imagine, Agnese Ravenswood was smiling at her puzzle completed, her grandson saved, her legacy living on in the complicated beauty of redemption earned through words, love, and the dangerous choice to see humans as more than their worst moments. Signore, I said one more time, just to feel the word on my tongue, to remember that first moment when everything changed. Signora, he responded, the word carrying 10 years of transformation, love, and the choice to be dangerous together. And in that single exchange, in that language his grandmother had preserved, we contained everything. Monster and man, darkness and light, violence and poetry, the past that shaped us and the future we were building one word, one choice, one dangerous moment of love at a time.